You are going to need some specialty tools to do this job without a press. You're going to need this 23-piece bearing press and puller set. I paid about $62 for this on Amazon. And you're going to need this slide hammer with hub puller set. I paid about $85 for this on Amazon. Both of these tools get rebranded by a lot of companies. This one by OTC is very well rated. This one, as long as you search for a 23-piece bearing set, you'll find it. These are about the cheapest prices you're going to get these for. I'll put the links in the description, and they're well worth the price because they pay for themselves if you use them once, and if you use them more than once, the price of each tool just goes way down. Other than that, you're definitely going to need some large sockets and some breaker bars, and a lot of basic hand tools, but if you do car work regularly, you should have everything you need. I like to crack each of the lug nuts free just a little bit of a turn before I jack the car up because the tire on the ground holds it nice and steady. So we've got to unstake this axle nut. As you can see right there, it's caved in. And to do that, I use a variety of tools. Mainly I find this awl comes in really handy. To at least get it started. It does tend to beat up the awl a little, but this thing's kind of a tank. And then just some kind of flathead screwdriver. Especially when you don't care about very much. It's almost there. I think that's good. Now I'm just going to jack up the car. I know you're probably not supposed to use the tow hooks for this, but I like to because it's easy. Don't forget a jack stand. Off with the wheel. I have an impact wrench I could use, but in the end this is about as fast. Now in most older Subarus, and most Subarus in general, this is a 32mm axle nut. And I think that's an indication that I don't have it fully unstaked. Or not. You can see I like to use a lot of never sees on that thing. It's going to get staked anyways. When you're working on the front, you can turn the wheel to make access to the caliper bracket bolts a little bit easier. These are typically 17mm. That loosened up pretty easy. Probably because I love my never sees. And I was in here recently changing this axle. No problem. Suppose I might as well get my air ratchet. Gotta get a bungee cord. Just gonna hang the caliper up out of my way. There's a bit of a lip here. Just a little bit. Pads are looking good. Gonna have to find a way to shorten that a little. Alright, I think that's gonna keep it out of my way. It's time to move on to the castle nut on the ball joint. Just gonna take off the rotor. Right down there. First we gotta take out this cotter pin, which should go fairly easily. This ball joint was replaced recently. Sometimes I have to hammer them out from one side, other times I can yank them out from the other side. This one I yanked out, and I need to loosen this castle nut, which I believe is a 19. Alright, and that loosened pretty easily, because again I did this all recently. Then I like to bring it down about even with the nut, and the next part gets a little violent. I like to get another jack under there. This cloth is just there to kind of protect the jack and the castle nut. If you can jack it up a little bit, it brings some force on this because of the sway bar, and then it has this held in place by the jack, so when you push down on this, it'll pop out. Now I'm going to try a trick I saw recently. Take the round end of a wrench, stick it in between the ball joint clamp and the A-arm, like so. And then when you lower the jack that's supporting the castle nut, it pops the ball joint out and then lets the wrench go. Let me see how it works out. Well, it's holding my wrench in there, but that's about it. Maybe a few tappy taps. There we go, that popped it. So that definitely helped because I was hammering on it before and getting nothing. Take off the castle nut. Now what I like to do is actually remove the sway bar link because it just makes messing around with the axle and the A-arm a lot easier. I find the lower sway bar link is a lot easier to deal with in general. I'm going to go with that one. 12mm on both sides. And that comes easy because I've done it recently and I never seize everything. Gotta get that bolt out. And all that's really supposed to do is take tension off this arm so that when you want to pull it down, it's a lot easier. One other thing I found, if you want help popping out the ball joint, turn the steering wheel so it's pushing out on it. Then when you have it turned, it puts force outward on it, so when you go to pop the ball joint, the hub's naturally going to want to come out. Not necessary, just a little bit helpful. And the other reason that's helpful is that now when I go to pull the axle out, because this is pushed out all the way, I can just pull on this side of the hub. The axle wants to slide right out. And I'm pulling it out as far as I can. Move the axle out of the way. Now next to replace the hub, I'm going to put the ball joint back into the lower part of the A-arm. I'm going to turn it back so that the tie rod end is pulling inward on the hub, making it want to go back to its home. Just aim it. There you go. Leaving the axle out, obviously. I am actually going to be removing the entire axle because I'm replacing it. But normally you wouldn't have to, even though it does help to have another part out of the way. Next I'm going to use a slide hammer to pull the hub out of the bearing. And that's why we put the ball joint back in the A-arm. And first I'm going to put this castle nut on just to help hold it in place. It has to be on all the way, but it doesn't actually have to be torqued down or anything. Alright, now I'm going to try to remove the hub with the slide hammer. And unfortunately I've found that this particular puller barely fits on this 5x100 hub. I'm not sure if maybe I can get an adapter somewhere, but we're going to try to make it work anyways. So I think what I'm going to end up with is one holding it very firmly, and these two just kind of resting on the body of the puller. And that'll have to do. I figure if I loosen those two a little bit, I can get this one further down. And then when I tighten them down all the way, this one will be pretty firmly pressed into the body with the tool. Just working with what I got. It's pretty firmly affixed. Just gotta screw this in enough. Then I can also screw a nut into the back of it. This set comes with this nut to help support it. And ideally, you would tighten that down, but I don't believe I have a wrench large enough to do so. So I'm just going to do my best with that as it is to pull this out. One thing I've found in the past is holding on to the handle while you pull. It helps a lot. It's coming right out, so that's good. Almost there, I think. I'm going to tighten these down a little bit. Okay, seems like that's about all I'm going to get. There she comes. There's the old bearing. You can see there's a lot of grease in there. That's actually because I repacked it recently, hoping to keep it alive a little longer. This was only a 5-pound sledge. I wanted to get a 10-pound, but obviously for a hub this size, worked pretty well. And you can see the inner bearing popped right out. Here's the old race we need to press out. So next we have to get out this inner circlip. It doesn't have holes, it just has notches, so I'm thinking it was designed to be done with a needle nose. You can see I have the unit turned as much as possible so I have decent access to the other side, and I cleaned it out about as much as I could. That was much easier than expected. Beautiful. And I didn't actually buy a new one of these because, I mean, I don't see why it would need to be replaced unless it was broken. So for this next step, I'm going to be using a universal bearing puller and press. And I'm going to be using a couple breaker bars with a 32 and a 1 1/4 because those are basically the same. One to turn the front in and one to hold the back. And for my Subaru specifically, we're going to be using the medium-sized ring, the screw, the standard bolt that holds the back. We're going to be using the size 10 plate, whatever that means, and the 001 to hold the ring. And I'll put the whole assembly together. So basically, this is going to go on the backs so that the race can fall into that. And this is going to be in the front, pushing the race through. This one's just the right size to fit inside of the knuckle while pushing on the race, but not pushing on this ridge that actually holds the race in place. So first, that's going to thread over the bolt, and then that's going to go through the race. We have this spacer, which just helps get the process done quicker, and then you thread this on like this. And I may actually not need the spacer because if I just turn this way instead, it'll give me some spacing anyways. And then you turn in that front bolt, and it's going to press it through and pop the race into the back. Before I really get started, I am going to grease this and the bolt that holds on the back, because otherwise it could be noisy and damage the threads. Alright, time to extract the race. First we get the bolt with the front plate. And then we put the cup on the back. Hold that in place. The backing plate. Looks like I'll go without the spacer. Put on the back bolt. Put one of the breaker bars on to hold everything in place. And you just crank down on the front. There we go, I felt it budge. Definitely coming out hard. As long as it's coming out. Now at some point there's a chance this may push the socket off. But if that happens, it should just start spinning. Won't be a problem. A lot of force. Get a little bit easier. And now I could use an impact gun for this. The problem is the shocks can scar the inside of the knuckle and make it harder to get the new one in or permanently damage it. So I don't want to risk that. I'm going to go nice smooth human horsepower. It's almost out. There she comes. We'll use the impact just to save time. And there's the inner race. And there's the inside of the hub. Hopefully, the new bearing will go in pretty easy. So to go ahead, I'm going to cut just the seal with a cutoff wheel. And I'm going to do that because I don't have to go all the way in order to get it off, and I don't want to risk damaging the hub, and cutting the ring is a lot harder. I'm going to start with that. I think that should basically have it. There we go, it broke. The rubber's still being kind of resilient. This thing is pretty sharp, so gotta be careful. Oh, I did lose all the bearings and the race, but that's not that important. I just think it'd be fun to do something with these, but I don't know what yet. Alright, so I'm going to cut a score in this race so that I can chisel it off, because I don't have any tools right now that'll pull it off. And try to chisel this off now. I need to cut it a little more. Got it to crack. There we go. So just as a note, you need to be careful with your chisel, because I did scar that up a little bit. Normally someone might replace that. I'm just going to try to flatten it out real quick. So I did just flatten that a little bit. As long as there's nothing sticking up, it's not going to interfere with anything. Here's the hub cleaned up before I put it in the freezer. There's a little bit of scoring on it, but I don't think it's going to prevent the new race from going on. It's a bit rusty. I haven't checked it for run out or tolerance or anything. I'm not that concerned with it. And it'll go in the freezer. Alright, so this is my setup to put the race back onto the hub. This is the old race. This is what I found to drive it. It's actually a race from a slightly larger bearing. I'm not sure what it went to, but as you can see, it's just slightly larger diameter than the race for the Subaru hub. So I'm going to use that to drive that down. And the full setup is I'm using the smallest cup on the backing plate with the bolt through it. The hub, which as you can see has been in the freezer, nice and cold. Just going to go on there. I'm going to put the seal on first, and then the new race with the driving race is going to push those down with the bolt in the plate. Looks like I may need to find a way to space it a little less though. So I'll probably start by just driving the new race and then put on the driving race. And just to know, I am using a new clean pair of gloves because when I take the new race out, which has grease in it, I don't want to get any debris in it. I've tried to clean everything off, including the driving race, and the hub is clean. So to start out with, I'm going to take the new outer seal. These are actually national brand seals instead of Timken, just because I've heard that Timken fit a little loosely, and when I put in a new inner Timken seal, it actually was very loose, and I do want them to seal well. Again, I'm just going to make sure this is nice and clean. I'm going to lube it. The outside of the seal and the inside. And this inner ring, the hollow side, goes towards the bearing. The flat side goes out towards the hub. That should fit over that fairly easily. It does. I'm going to clean off my gloves. Make sure there's no grime on that. I'm going to lube the hub real quick. And that grease gets nice and tacky when it's cold. But it should help lubricate the new bearing going on. I'm going to take out one of my races. And the reason I don't press this all together at the same time is in doing my research I found that if you press the bearing into the hub, I should say into the knuckle, with the new outer race, the rollers can press into the race and actually damage it. So you want to do this one step at a time. Okay, again, you want to make sure you get no debris in any of this. Start with a plate so that it only pushes on this inner race. You don't want it to push on the cage. And the driving bolt. Then I'm going to get my two drivers, and then I'm going to use my hand just to hold that in place. I'll hold one side still, crank the other side. It's going on very easy, which is good. I think having the hub in the freezer definitely helps. And at some point that's going to bottom out against the hub. Good. Now we can take this off. I'm going to get the race. The reason I chose this size is that it fits very nicely in there. Put this on. My driving bolt. And I'm hoping this is going to get us just far enough. Oh, it's just barely too little. So what I'm going to do is take this out. And I can actually use this plate in reverse, which gives us plenty more clearance. Won't hold that outer race nicely in place, but now that it's around the hub, I don't need to worry as much about that. And we can finish tightening this up. You can see the gap right there, just very skinny right now. And gave it a pretty good crank, but it's all the way in. So I should probably loosen that here so that I can actually get it off. And there you have it. The new bearing pressed under the old hub. And this seal should butt right up against it. And I'll probably add some more grease around that edge before I actually put it on the car, just to help block any water. Now before I install the inner race, I just want to note, I cleaned this as thoroughly as I could. I ground this edge with a wire wheel because it was getting kind of rusty. You can see I got that inner bearing surface nice and clean. I'll hit it with the air gun one more time before I actually go to install. I cleaned that back edge too, as well as I could back here. And that's because that has a seal on it as well. And I'm going to lube this so that when I drive in the inner race, it'll have some lubrication and won't fight me. But you want this all nice and clean, no debris, so the race goes in cleanly and so that you don't get anything into the bearings. So even in this inner groove where the snap ring goes in, I want to make sure that's nice and clean, because if there's any debris in there and it comes out after you install the bearing, it could ruin the bearing. So the plan for pulling the inner race into the hub is that I'm going to use this 08 plate to push it in, because it's just smaller than the race is, so that should be able to fit in and continue to pull it. I'm going to use this 001 plate on the front because this screw sits nicely on the knuckle, and just the screw and the bolt, and that should be enough to get the job done. I'm going to start by putting in the front plate with the screw. Sit there. I'm going to grab the inner race. Try very hard not to get any debris on it. And the backing plate. And I'm going to go grab the spacer real quick, just because that's going to help get this done quicker. I just want to make sure this lines up nicely with the bearing. As I'm pulling this in, the bearing's moving a little bit. There we go. Put one socket on the back bolt, one socket on the front. I'm going to start out nice and slow. I know it's going to go in nice and even. Seems fine to me. Just keep pulling it in. Like I said earlier in the process, this might end up popping off. Hopefully not, but we'll see how it goes. Make sure that this isn't sticking out on any side. It seems okay to me. The good thing is it's never going to contact the actual seating surface anyways, because the race will take up that space. It's going about as easily as I would hope. It's definitely a tight fit, but again, I think putting it in the freezer helps. Physics and all that. So I think that's it. Looks pressed in all the way to me. Give it a good crank. And this I'm definitely going to take off with the impact gun, just to save time. Just quick. And there's a little bit of debris in there, so I'm definitely going to clean it out. But there you have it. The new inner race installed. Next goes in the snap ring, and I'm actually amazed these needle nose will hold it. I'm not unhappy about it. And I did clean this thoroughly, as with all parts in the process. Because again, you don't want any debris in there. That's seated nicely. Just make sure it's all the way in. Good to go. The last step of this process is to press the entire hub into the knuckle with the other race on the back side, keeping it all together. And that goes on that way. Here's the final race. And to do that, we're going to use the bolt through the front, of course. We're going to use a plate that fits kind of nicely around the hub. We're going to use a backing plate to push on the race, and probably the spacer to get it all done quicker. And I believe you press this on until this part of the race butts up against the same part on the other side's race, and that's when it's finished being pressed. And before I press this all in, I've put a coating of lubricant on there, proper grease, synthetic, Royal Purple Ultra, and I'm going to grease this lip heavily. I don't need to grease this one yet, but this one's what makes the seal with that outer seal, and I'm going to make sure everything is nicely lubricated and sealed so that bearing has a long life. Alright, here we go. I did have this hub back in the freezer just to help the process. It sits right in there. Just going to try to make sure it doesn't fall down. I'll put the bolt through, put the plate on. Always make sure your hands are nice and clean if possible. We got the inner race. Slide it over and into place. The plate that's going to press it on. Make sure everything's clean. In this case, the spacer and the bolt that ties it all together. And same procedure as always. Lock down the back, start torquing on the front. This one's going really easily, which hopefully is not a bad sign of any sort. So I have it pretty well torqued down. I'm just going to inspect it. So I did actually discover I need to go one plate smaller because the old plate was hitting the retaining ring. So I'm going to use this smaller plate to secure it, because you can probably see this hub has lateral movement and it's not supposed to at all. Got the whole assembly back together. Should just be doing the final tighten. It's pretty firmly tightened. So now I'm just going to check for play again. Now that feels nice and solid. It's hard to turn, but that's okay, because it should be nice and greased in there. It's kind of cold. So once I get the wheel back on, I'll test just to make sure there's absolutely no play in there, but I think we're good. Of course, don't forget to install your inner seal. This one's National brand again. The Timken one I got last time did not come with this inner lip, which is supposed to seal against the axle. The hollow side goes against the bearing, and the lip side goes against the axle, so it installs this way. I thoroughly cleaned and lubricated the seal and the knuckle. And sometimes you can get these to go in by hand. Sometimes you have to use a driver. I think I'm just actually going to use my bearing press set to finish driving that in. So to get that seal in the rest of the way, I'm just going to use a small hammer and one of the drivers from the bearing installation kit. May seem like overkill, but the seal really isn't cooperating with me and going in straight. And I will note the Timken seal I bought last time just went in by hand very easily and was a very loose fit, which means it's not going to seal out water very well. So I'm actually more confident that this seal is going to work properly. And in this step, you don't want to go crazy tight. I just want it to go in evenly. But if you are driving in this seal with your bearing installation set, at least it's going to drive it in nice and straight. So I just barely got that tight. I'm going to call that good. Because there's that lip on there that you don't want to damage, and it's made of rubber and steel, so you could damage the rubber components. And you just want to check to make sure that that lip is even all the way around. Which I would say it looks pretty good. So the last steps are going to be to install the axle. Again, I'm replacing it, so there's a new one going in. And then put the wheel and tire on, and it's ready to go. So now to put the axle in, take that castle nut off. And as I've done in the past, turn my steering wheel all the way to the left. I'm going to pop the ball joint, take off the axle nut. It says Interparts HX. Who knows what that means? Try not to damage the seal when you're doing this. Try to line it up as best you can. Start pushing it in. I'm going to go back, turn the steering wheel completely to the right, which should pull it in. Again, push the A-arm down. This ball joint's still nice and firm, which is good. Means it doesn't need to be replaced. Get everything to pop back together. Center the steering wheel. Make sure it's all friends. And we're looking pretty good. Then, before I put in this axle nut, I'm going to grease it in here, and I'm going to never seize the axle nut. Now the reason I like to grease it thoroughly inside of here is because it loves to corrode, and so I just want to prevent that. Big glob of grease. Doesn't matter if you get any on the threads. It's not going to hurt anything. This gets staked. Want some on the mating surface. You can put it on the outside too if you want, or never seize. Anything works. Just helps prevent corrosion, helps keep wheels from sticking. I don't want to get a lot of grease on the lugs. That's not the end of the world. Not going to really hurt anything. And then I like to never seize the threads and the axle nut. And that's just because this does have some kind of minor coating on it, but it will also corrode. And since this takes a lot of torque to go on, corroded, it'll take a ton of torque to come off. Now we're just going to get this started. You might notice I'm a huge fan of lubricating everything thoroughly, and I am. It's never hurt me, and it's definitely helped. I'm going to go ahead and reinstall the castle nut. It's already got some never seize on there. And I looked it up online, and I believe the correct spec is 33 foot-pounds, and then continue less than 60 degrees to align the cotter pin hole. So I've already got my torque wrench set. The hole's not quite aligned, but it's getting there. It's a little more. I'd say that's probably well within spec. Install the cotter pin. I'm going to use the method where you bend the bottom, put the pin down and around, and I'm just going to push the other one up and indent it a little. Doesn't really matter how you do this as long as it stays out of the way. And we'll keep that bolt in place. I'm going to reinstall the rotor and caliper. Always make sure you don't have that brake hose twisted. Now that seems silly, but I have seen it done. A little bit of never seize on the tips of these caliper bracket bolts. It's partially to prevent corrosion, and partially I think it'll come out easy the next time. I just want to get them started. Switch over to my air ratchet. Now before I call that done, I will actually loosen each of these a hair, just to make sure The caliper is nicely seated where it wants to be, and I'll tighten them by hand. Now the proper torque spec for these bolts, depending on who you ask, is somewhere between 27.5 and 59 foot-pounds. I honestly usually just torque them down with a wrench about as hard as I can, because the length of this wrench is going to limit my torque output enough that I'm not going to damage anything, but it is going to tighten these enough, and I've never had one try to loosen on me. Here's what I found on Nasiak as the torque spec for the axle nut, 137 foot-pounds. And it does say always tighten axle nut before installing wheel on the vehicle. If wheel is installed before it is tightened, it may damage the wheel bearing. Good to know. Also note it says while depressing the brake pedal. So I'm going to have the transmission in gear, and I'm going to have someone hold the brake pedal while I tighten the nut. I'm going to tighten the axle nut. Okay, hold the brake. As I said, this is supposed to be torqued to 137 foot-pounds. I don't actually have a torque wrench that goes that high, so I'm going to stand on it at about 1 foot away from the center, because I weigh about 150 pounds, 145, and that should torque it properly. I'm pretty much going to call that good.
Let go?
Yep. Okay, now I'm going to pin in the axle nut so that it stays nice and secure. I'm going to use that broken screwdriver and my small sledge. There are better tools for this job, I'm sure, but anything works. And then just to make sure that it's caved in enough, I'm going to switch to my big old screwdriver. And you just got to make sure that it's making contact in there. Not going to go anywhere. Looks good to me. Now we do have to reinstall the sway bar link, and that's going to be made a bit easier if we raise the A-arm to the proper height. It can be a bit of a pain to bend it back in there. I'll try not to damage the rubber. That went very easily. A little bit of never sees on here, especially on the face of the bolt, but also on the threads. 12mm wrench, 12mm on the air ratchet. Let's make sure that that's torqued properly. Good to me. Lastly, it's back on with the wheel. At least start your lug nuts by hand. And put this one in all the way, just so that the wheel gets held in place. Start the others. Put it in gear, just to torque them down a bit more. And get the torque wrench. So the torque spec for this car is 58 to 72 foot-pounds according to the owner manual. I like to torque it to 60 first, and then go to 65 or 68. That way I'm not quite at the max torque spec, but I know it's going to stay on there. So right now I have it set to 60. Always tighten in a star pattern. Usually I get to about 60 by hand with the 4-way. I tighten in just a hair. And now I have it set to 68. Yeah, I'll tighten just a hair more, which is good. That's what you want. And just double check them. And I know some people think torquing your lug nuts is overkill, but it helps make sure your brake rotor doesn't warp. It helps make sure that the wheel feels nice and balanced going down the road. And it helps make sure that it's not going to come off while you're driving, which I have had happen while I was in someone else's car. Wasn't a fun experience. Lastly, remove the jack stands over the car. Go for a test drive. Can't forget the finishing touch. Ta-da! Hey, if you're still watching, I really hope this video helped you out. If you like the video, hit the like button so other people know it's any good. If you have any feedback of any kind, please leave a comment. And if you want to see more repair videos like this, please subscribe. It'll help me grow my channel. I really appreciate it, and have a great year.